It was a bitter November evening when I first encountered the case that would come to define my time with Holmes. The chill wind swept through the darkened streets of London, tugging at the hems of my coat and sending a shiver down my spine. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly along the cobbled roads, their feeble light struggling to pierce the shadows. The weight of the city's fog clung to the streets, making everything appear as though it were suspended in a dream, half real and half imagined. It was the sort of night that seemed to carry a certain foreboding, one that suggested something unknown was lurking just out of view, waiting for its moment to strike. Holmes had been unusually quiet that day, the faintest hint of tension in the air. He paced around the room, looking out the window, occasionally adjusting the papers on his desk. I had attempted to engage him in conversation, but he simply nodded, or muttered some half-formed response. His mind, as I had come to learn, was often consumed by puzzles too intricate to share with anyone, yet it was in those moments of silence that I knew the wheels of his brilliant mind were turning, processing, analyzing, and working through what no one else could. We had just settled down for the evening, me with a book in hand, and Holmes lost in his own thoughts, when the doorbell rang with a suddenness that made both of us jump. I rose, somewhat irritated at the interruption, but my mood was quickly dashed when I opened the door to reveal a striking woman. Her face was pale, almost ethereal beneath the dark veil she wore, and her eyes were bloodshot, as though she had not slept in days. Despite the tiredness in her features, there was a certain elegance about her grace that spoke of nobility, or at least a life lived with privilege. In her hands, she clutched a small, leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been handled countless times. Still looked worn out, like someone who had been traveling for far longer than was safe. Yet there was something steely in the way she held herself, something that suggested she had made a decision long ago to see this matter through to its bitter end. "I need Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please, it's urgent." Her words cut through the quiet of the room, and I motioned for her to come inside. She stepped forward quickly, almost as if she were being followed, casting furtive glances down the dark hallway behind her before stepping fully into the warmth of our room. I closed the door behind her, my curiosity piqued, and led her to the chair across from Holmes, who had not yet made a move. He simply sat there, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he observed the woman. There was always something unsettling in the way he looked at people. He seemed to see through them, to peel back their outer layers until he reached the very core of their being. As she seated herself, she hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting nervously around the room. I took note of her actions, how she adjusted her gloves, how her eyes flickered to the ledger in her hands. It was clear that whatever was contained within that book had an importance far beyond its modest appearance. "Mr. Holmes," she began again after a long, tension-filled pause, "I fear I am being followed, and I am not the only one." Holmes said nothing at first. He simply studied her, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He gave nothing away, as always. It was a tactic that had, on more than one occasion, disarmed those who came to him for help. But I knew him well enough to see that his mind was already at work, processing the subtle cues, the trembling hands, the slightly hoarse tone in her voice, the way her eyes darted between Holmes and the ledger as if it held some terrible secret. "Tell me more," Holmes finally said, his voice low and steady, almost inviting her to speak further. I have been receiving threats," she continued, her voice quivering slightly. "Strange letters, strange visitors, people I do not recognize. They seem to want this," she said, motioning to the ledger. "I don't know who they are, but I believe they're after my husband's debts, and I believe they are connected to his death." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "Your husband's death? What happened to him?" She swallowed hard, as though she was struggling to find the right words. He died suddenly, Mr. Holmes. The doctors said it was a stroke, but I know better. It was no stroke, I believe. He was murdered. A sudden silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock. I looked at Holmes, who seemed unfazed by her claim. He had seen such statements before, grief-stricken people often attributing mysterious deaths to foul play. And yet, something in the woman's eyes made me hesitate. There was more to this than met the eye. Holmes reached out for the ledger, taking it with the same delicate touch he reserved for objects of intrigue. His fingers brushed against the worn leather, and he opened it slowly, flipping through the pages with a sort of methodical precision that only he could muster. Each page was filled with names, dates, and figures, debtors, amounts, and various transactions. It was clear from the worn edges and the yellowed pages that this was no ordinary accounting book. It had been through many hands, many times, and held secrets buried beneath the ink. Debt, Holmes murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Debt has a way of driving men to desperate actions. But I sense that there's more to this ledger than mere financial ruin. He flipped another page, and then another, his brow furrowing slightly. It was subtle, but I noticed the change in his demeanor. He had seen something that had sparked his curiosity. He paused for a moment, his fingers lingering over one of the entries, before lifting his gaze to meet the woman's. "And what do you believe this ledger contains?" Holmes asked, his voice cool and precise. The woman's eyes flickered nervously. "I believe it contains the names of those responsible for my husband's death. His dealings were not entirely legal, Mr. Holmes. He owed money to dangerous men who would stop at nothing to collect, and I fear that they may be coming for me now that he is gone." Holmes nodded slowly, clearly weighing her words. "You believe your husband's death was linked to these debts, then? And now these men are after you as well?" The woman nodded, her face pale and drawn. "Yes, and there's one name I'm afraid to speak." Holmes' eyes narrowed, and I could feel the tension in the room mount. "Which name?" She hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling as though the words were stuck in her throat. "Sir Henry Ashcombe." I had heard of Ashcombe. His name was synonymous with power and influence in certain circles of London society. He was a man whose wealth was rumored to come from sources as shadowy as the alleys of Whitechapel. His reach extended into every facet of the city's elite, politics, business, even law enforcement. It was a name that carried weight, and yet the thought of it on the lips of a woman in such distress made my blood run cold. Holmes paused, his gaze flickering for just a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible sign of recognition. He had known of Ashcombe, of course. It was impossible not to. But now, with this new information, the case had taken a darker turn. A man of Ashcombe's standing would not allow something like a ledger to slip through his fingers without a great deal of attention. And what's more, if the woman's story was to be believed, her life was in immediate danger. "Well, Watson," Holmes said finally, his tone sharp and commanding, "I believe we have much work to do." I looked at him, knowing full well that once Holmes set his sights on a case, there would be no turning back. This would be no ordinary investigation. This was a case of death, power, and secrets long buried beneath layers of lies and debts. As I watched Holmes rise from his seat, already consumed with thoughts of how to proceed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something far more sinister than either of us could anticipate. The following morning, Holmes wasted no time. As was his custom, he had already made plans, and I was to follow his lead without question. It seemed that the wheels of his mind had been turning through the night, and he was now determined to put his theories into motion. Our first task, Holmes declared, was to visit the late Mr. Stanton's residence, an old, crumbling manor on the outskirts of London that once gleamed with wealth and prestige, but now stood as a shadow of its former self. The morning air was sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. The sky was overcast, a dull gray sheet hanging above us as we made our way through the fog. I felt a subtle unease settle in my chest, an instinct I knew to trust when it came to matters involving Holmes. It was always in the quiet moments before a case revealed its true face that I sensed the danger. But I had come to understand that this was part of the process, part of the mind of Sherlock Holmes. We arrived at the Stanton estate by mid-morning. It was a sprawling property situated on the edge of a long avenue where the wealthiest citizens of London once resided. Now, the house stood in a state of disrepair, its once pristine stone walls chipped and weathered, and its grand gates hanging loosely on their hinges. The front lawn had long since been overtaken by wild grasses, and the ornate garden that had once been a symbol of opulence now lay in ruin. The mansion loomed like a sentinel to the past, its very presence sending a chill down my spine. Holmes wasted no time in approaching the front door, a gleam of purpose in his eyes. The woman, Mrs. Stanton, had provided us with a key to the manor. She had insisted that no one else could be trusted with the house, and I could understand why. There was an air of danger about this place, as though it held secrets better left undiscovered. But Holmes, of course, was not one to shy away from such matters. He entered the house, the heavy door groaning in protest as it opened. The interior was even more haunting than the exterior. It covered every surface in the once grand chandelier. In the entrance hall hung crookedly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was deafening. I noticed that the house seemed to still, as if the very life had been sucked out of it. Holmes, ever the professional, was already inspecting the space with his usual acute attention to detail. He moved through the rooms with a quiet deliberation, noting the smallest irregularities, the faintest signs of disturbance. His observations were methodical, as though he were assembling a puzzle from the broken pieces of a life now lost. I followed closely behind, making sure to take note of everything he did. The study, which had once been the heart of Mr. Stanton's work, was the first room we investigated. The desk was cluttered with papers, the ink on many of them long since faded. A half-burned candle sat on the edge of the table, its wax dripping onto the hardwood floor in slow, steady drops. The room had the unmistakable feel of a place where someone had been in a hurry, where work had been abandoned in the middle of something important. Holmes moved to the desk and began rifling through the papers with a steady hand, pausing occasionally to examine a particular letter or note. "Ah, Watson," he said, his voice laced with the excitement that always accompanied a breakthrough. "Take a look at this." He handed me a letter that had been hastily stuffed into one of the drawers. It was addressed to Mr. Stanton, but it was the sender that caught my attention. The envelope bore no return address, only a cryptic symbol that I didn't recognize. Holmes turned the letter over and, with a flick of his wrist, broke the seal. He read it aloud. "Your time is running out. The ledger must be returned, or there will be consequences. Ashcombe will not tolerate delays. Pay your debts or pay with your life." The words were cold, threatening, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Holmes read the letter twice before slipping it back into the envelope and slipping it into his coat pocket. "This is interesting, Watson," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of purpose. "It seems our suspicions about Sir Henry Ashcombe were not misplaced, but this letter raises more questions than it answers. Who would send such a message? And why leave it so plainly in the open for anyone to find?" I pondered the letter for a moment, but Holmes had already moved on, his attention shifting to the far corner of the room where a small, unassuming bookshelf stood. It appeared to be nothing more than a place to store books, but I knew by now that Holmes never overlooked anything. He approached the shelf with the same quiet intensity, running his fingers over the spines of the books. After a few moments of scrutiny, he pulled one from the shelf. It was a thick volume, its cover worn with age and neglect. Holmes flipped through the pages rapidly, his eyes scanning the text with remarkable speed. "Here," he said, stopping at a page that appeared to have been bookmarked. He showed it to me. The page contained a list of names, seemingly random individuals, and next to each name, an amount of money owed. The names were familiar to me: businessmen, politicians, and other influential figures within London society. But what caught my attention was the final name on the list. It read, Sir Henry Ashcombe. Holmes smiled darkly, folding the page back and returning the book to the shelf. "It seems, Watson, that our Mr. Stanton had more than just a passing acquaintance with Ashcombe. He was indebted to him in a very substantial way. But the question remains, why did he owe so much?" I felt a sense of growing unease. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were coming together in a way I had not expected. The deeper we delved into Mr. Stanton's affairs, the darker they seemed to become. This was no simple case of financial ruin. There was something far more sinister at play. Holmes then turned to me, his gaze steady. "We will need to speak with Mrs. Stanton again, Watson. I believe there is more she has yet to tell us." We left the study and made our way back to the front hall. The house seemed to watch us as we passed through it, its empty halls echoing with memories of a life long since extinguished. As we stepped out into the cold morning air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not merely investigating a death, but rather walking into a trap set long ago. One that had been carefully constructed by a mind far more dangerous than I had first imagined. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I found myself wondering just how much more there was to uncover about Sir Henry Ashcombe, and what lengths he would go to in order to keep his secrets buried. Holmes, however, was already several steps ahead, and I could only trust that he had a plan. His case, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. This investigation, as Holmes had so often said, was a matter of seeing what others overlooked, of noticing the patterns hidden in plain sight. And I had no doubt that the answers lay somewhere in the twisted connections between the names, debts, and motives that stretched far beyond the reach of one man's death. But for now, we had more questions than answers, and it was those questions that would lead us deeper into the heart of the mystery. Our return to Baker Street was marked by a stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation that only seemed to grow as Holmes stewed over the developments we had uncovered. I, on the other hand, felt an increasing sense of unease. The more I reflected on the cryptic letter, the more troubling it became. Who would send such a direct threat, and why? What did Sir Henry Ashcombe stand to gain from such a sordid affair? My thoughts spiraled, but I knew that Holmes would have an answer, or at least a direction. By the time we arrived back at our familiar rooms, the daylight had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the floor. Holmes was already pacing, his mind far ahead of anything I could comprehend. I, meanwhile, settled into my chair, staring at the fireplace as though its warmth might somehow chase away the tension that clung to the air. "What do you make of this, Watson?" Holmes asked suddenly, his voice breaking through the silence like a knife. He had clearly been lost in his own thoughts, as usual. He held the letter from Sir Henry Ashcombe, which he had carefully removed from his coat pocket. Hay was turning it over in his hands, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The elegant, yet menacing handwriting seemed to carry the weight of an unspeakable threat. "It is a peculiar thing, Holmes," I replied, not taking my eyes off the flickering flames. "The tone is direct, and yet it feels almost personal. Ashcombe's connection to Mr. Stanton is certainly more than just financial. It seems that these debts were not mere transactions. They were obligations, entanglements that went far beyond money. Holmes nodded, his fingers tracing the letter as though the ink itself could tell him something more. Indeed, Watson. What is most troubling is the casual nature of the threat. Whoever wrote this letter is certain of their power, certain that Stanton's death was no accident, and that it would go unpunished. But why leave such a letter out in the open? Why not take it with them? I asked, furrowing my brow. The whole thing seems careless, as if the killer was not worried about being discovered. Holmes paused, considering my words. Yes, that is the odd part. Normally, such a letter would be hidden away, destroyed. This one, however, was left behind intentionally. I believe we are dealing with someone who has far more confidence than we have anticipated. This letter was meant to be found, Watson. It's part of a game. I felt a knot tighten in my chest as I considered Holmes' words. The idea that someone might be toying with us, the idea that the killer wanted to be discovered, was a chilling thought. But before I could voice my concerns, Holmes was already moving, as though propelled by some invisible force. "We must return to Mrs. Stanton's residence," he declared. "She holds the key to unraveling this." The journey to Mrs. Stanton's home was uneventful, yet it carried with it an air of inevitability. I found myself wondering if she was aware of the gravity of the situation. Did she truly understand the danger she was in? It was a question I could not yet answer. Holmes, of course, had his own thoughts, though he shared little with me on the way. We arrived at the manor late in the afternoon. The evening shadows had begun to stretch across the grounds, and the light filtering through the trees cast an eerie glow over the house. It was quiet, too quiet, and I could feel a chill creep up my spine as we approached the door. Mrs. Stanton greeted us at the threshold, her face drawn and pale. The look of distress was still evident in her eyes, but there was something else, now an air of caution, as though she were preparing herself for a confrontation. "You've returned?" she said quietly, ushering us inside. Her voice was calm, but there was a nervous edge to it, a slight tremor in the way she moved. I had the distinct feeling that she was holding something back, something that she feared might be uncovered. Holmes wasted no time, heading straight for the study without a word. Mrs. Stanton followed closely behind, her footsteps faltering ever so slightly. I could see her unease, and yet she seemed reluctant to speak. She had been so forthcoming before, but now there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. "Mrs. Stanton," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the silence as he sat down at the desk. "I believe there is more to this story than you have told us. You've already admitted to hiding the ledger, but I have reason to believe there is something else you've kept from us." She blinked, her lips pressing tightly together. For a moment, she said nothing, and I could almost hear the struggle within her. But then, with a heavy sigh, she sank into the chair opposite Holmes, her hands wringing in her lap. "I have told you everything I know," she said softly. I don't understand what else you need." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You speak of your husband's debts, yet you fail to mention how deeply entangled he was. In them, the debts to Ashcombe were not just financial. There is something else, something you are not telling us." She looked away, as though afraid to meet his gaze. There was a long silence before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "There is more, but I am afraid. I fear that telling you more will only put both of you in greater danger. I didn't want to burden you with it." Holmes remained unmoved, his expression unreadable. "Burden us?" he asked, his tone strangely gentle. "Mrs. Stanton, you came to us for help. I suggest you tell us everything, for your own sake." Her hands shook as she clasped them tightly together, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I didn't know what to do. she murmured. I was afraid of what might happen if I said too much, but you are right. I owe you the truth. My husband was involved in something far darker than I realized. Holmes sat back, his eyes never leaving her face. Go on, he said, his voice almost coaxing now. Mrs. Stanton hesitated, taking a deep breath as though preparing herself for something monumental. He had become involved in a secret group led by none other than Sir Henry Ashcombe. It wasn't just about money or business. There were other things at play, things I couldn't understand at the time, but I began to see signs. Strange men came and went from our house at hours. Sometimes there were meetings in the middle of the night. She paused, clearly distressed by the memories. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but the growing realization that we were dealing with something far more sinister than we had first imagined gave me little comfort. And you never thought to warn us? Holmes asked, his tone sharper now, though I could sense the underlying concern. I didn't know what to do, she replied, her voice breaking. I thought it was all over after his death, but now I fear for my life. I fear that they will come for me next. Holmes rose from his seat, his expression suddenly more solemn than I had ever seen it. I believe you are in grave danger, Mrs. Stanton, but we cannot help you unless you provide us with everything you know. There are pieces to this puzzle that remain hidden, and I intend to find them. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. I'll tell you everything, she whispered. I exchanged a look with Holmes. I had the distinct feeling that we were on the cusp of something much more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. As Holmes began to speak with Mrs. Stanton about the group her husband had been involved with, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched our every move, scrutinized by unseen eyes. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and I knew that, for better or worse, we were now entangled in something much darker than mere debts. The game had changed, and our lives had just become a part of it. Holmes, as always, was a step ahead, but even he could not predict the depth of the darkness that awaited us. It was late evening by the time we left Mrs. Stanton's residence. The air sharp with a bite of cold, and a heavy sense of impending danger hung in the air like an oppressive fog. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the more we uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. I could feel Holmes' mind racing, weaving together the threads of this case with a precision that I could never hope to match. Yet, despite his usual confidence, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was wary of the shadows closing in around us. As we walked back to Baker Street, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that we were missing something crucial, something right under our noses. Holmes, of course, did not seem troubled. In fact, he was unusually quiet, his expression inscrutable as we moved through the empty streets, the only sounds the soft thud of our footsteps against the cobblestones. What is it, Holmes? Asked, after a while, unable to keep the curiosity at bay. You've been silent for some time now. You seem preoccupied. Holmes glanced at me, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring whether or not to answer. I am always preoccupied, Watson, he said with a slight smirk, though there was no humor in his voice. But I have been thinking, as you have, about the direction of this case. No, there are still many unanswered questions. You think? Mrs. Stanton was telling the truth, I ventured, still uneasy about her involvement. The woman had revealed more than I had expected, but I couldn't help but wonder if there was still more she was hiding. Of course, she was telling the truth, Holmes replied matter-of-factly, but that does not mean she told us everything. There are gaps in her story, Watson. It's pieces of the puzzle that do not fit together. Need to focus on what she did not say, not just what she did. His words lingered in my mind as we reached our rooms. Holmes had already begun to unbutton his coat and stow his hat when he turned to me with a sudden intensity. We need to find out more about Sir Henry Ashcombe's dealings, and not just through the lens of Mr. Stanton's debts. Ashcombe is more than a man with business interests. He is a man who controls, who manipulates. His influence runs far deeper than we have yet seen. I nodded, understanding that we were now dealing with a far larger game than we had originally anticipated. It wasn't just about a man's death or a ledger filled with debts. It was about power. And power, as Holmes often reminded me, was not so easily untangled. The next day, we set out to learn more about Ashcombe's background. Holmes had a network of contacts that spanned across every corner of London, from the most respectable men in society to the seedy underground figures who knew every whisper of gossip. As we made our way to one of Holmes' trusted informants, an unassuming bookseller in the heart of the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the case pressing down on me. The bookseller, a man named Mr. Thomas, was a stout fellow, with round glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His shop was a quiet place, filled with the scent of old paper and ink, and shelves stacked high with volumes of every kind. Holmes greeted him with his usual curt nod, and Mr. Thomas responded in kind, though his eyes flickered nervously as if he knew the importance of the conversation they were about to have. "Mr. Thomas, I need information," Holmes said bluntly, without preamble, "about Sir Henry Ashcombe." The bookseller's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come, you say? I've heard the rumors, Mr. Holmes, but be warned, this man is not one to be trifled with. He's as dangerous as they come." Holmes leaned forward, his piercing gaze never leaving Mr. Thomas's face. "I'm aware of that, but I need more. Something specific. Anything that could connect him to the debts left behind by a certain Mr. Stanton." Mr. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but eventually nodded. "I can tell you this much," he began cautiously. "Ashcombe has been involved in some very unsavory business over the years, especially concerning certain wealthy families. He's known for his discretion. There are whispers that he has a way of acquiring secrets, of bending people to his will. And when he's done with them, he discards them like they never existed." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And how does he acquire these secrets?" "I don't know the specifics," Mr. Thomas replied quickly, "but I've heard it said that Ashcombe has a way of making people do things they don't want to do. Threats, blackmail, the usual sort of thing. And it's never clear whether he's involved directly. He prefers to remain behind the scenes, manipulating events from afar." Holmes murmured, taking in the information. "That's useful. Is there anything more? Is any connection to Mr. Stanton?" Mr. Thomas hesitated again before speaking. "There is one thing, Mr. Holmes. A while ago, I heard talk of a secret ledger, one that was said to contain all of Ashcombe's dealings. It's been circulating for years in the hands of a few trusted individuals. They say whoever possesses that ledger can control the flow of power in London's highest circles. It's said to contain the names of everyone Ashcombe has ever manipulated." Holmes' eyes flashed with interest. "Where is it now?" "That," Mr. Thomas replied, lowering his voice even further, "is the question. No one knows for sure. Some say Ashcombe has it hidden away. Others believe it was lost long ago. But I wouldn't be surprised if it resurfaces soon. People like Ashcombe don't leave such things to chance." Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already processing the new information. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. That will be all for now." We left the bookstore soon after, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily between us. I could see that Holmes was deep in thought, his mind working through the possibilities. Despite the pieces that were slowly falling into place, I could not shake the feeling that we were still only scratching the surface. This was a game much larger than just one man's death. It was about control, power, and, ultimately, survival. Later that evening, as we sat in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes turned to me with a sudden intensity that left no room for doubt. "Watson, I believe it is time we confront Sir Henry Ashcombe directly." The thought of meeting a man as dangerous and elusive as Ashcombe sent a chill through me, but I knew that it was the only way forward. We had come too far to turn back now, and so, with that, we set our course. The web of deceit that Ashcombe had spun was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before we would confront him face to face. But the question lingered: how far was Ashcombe willing to go to protect his secrets? And more importantly, how far would we have to go to expose them? As Holmes turned to prepare for our next steps, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This was only the beginning, and I feared that the answers we sought would come at a cost we were not yet prepared to pay the night before we were due to visit Sir Henry Ashcombe's mansion. A sense of unease gripped me with an intensity I had not felt in years. Holmes had always been a man who pursued the truth without hesitation, no matter the danger, but this time, even he seemed more withdrawn than usual. His eyes were alight with a cold focus, yet I sensed an undercurrent of caution in the way he moved, in the way his usually sure footsteps seemed more deliberate, more measured. The mansion we were about to visit was situated on the edge of London, far removed from the bustling streets of the city. Its grandeur was undeniably an imposing structure with tall, wrought-iron gates that looked more like a fortress than a residence. The estate was meticulously maintained, every stone in place, every piece of ivy climbing the walls, as if under the watchful eye of a meticulous gardener. The home belonged to a man of vast influence, and it was clear that Sir Henry Ashcombe liked to keep his affairs as orderly and pristine as his surroundings. Yet something about the place struck me as cold, too perfect, too carefully constructed. We arrived late in the afternoon, when the light was fading and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with each passing minute. The weather had turned, and a damp fog had begun to roll in, giving the landscape an eerie, almost otherworldly appearance. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey, his mind, no doubt, already working through every potential scenario that could arise from this meeting. I, on the other hand, found myself unnerved by the oppressive silence that surrounded us. The estate was heavily guarded, a fact that Holmes had anticipated. We were greeted by a butler of middle age, whose face was impassive, though his sharp eyes seemed to size us up in an instant. He led us through a grand hallway lined with portraits of men and women whose names, no doubt, were etched in the annals of history. Their painted gazes followed us as we moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, as though warning us of the dangers that lay ahead. Holmes was, as always, unaffected by such things. His attention was focused on the details, on the subtle shift of a chair, the faintest dusting of soot on a fireplace, the way the paintings were arranged. I, however, could not shake the sense that we were intruding in a place where the air itself was charged with secrets. It's a place where even the slightest misstep could lead to dire consequences. The butler led us into a sitting room where a fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sir Henry Ashcombe was waiting for us there, seated in a high-backed leather chair. He was exactly as I had imagined, tall, with an air of aristocratic refinement that was impossible to ignore. His sharp features, framed by silver-streaked dark hair, were set in an expression of casual authority. He appeared calm, almost too calm, as if he had been expecting us. "Mr. Holmes," Ashcombe said, in a voice that was smooth and controlled, "and Dr. Watson, I presume, a pleasure to meet you both." Holmes did not offer a smile, nor did he extend his hand. Instead, he simply inclined his head, his eyes locking with Ashcombe's in a silent challenge. "The pleasure is mine, Sir Henry," Holmes said, his voice measured, almost too polite. "I trust you are well." Ashcombe's lips quirked upward slightly, though it was not a warm smile. "As well as can be expected," he replied smoothly. "I must admit, I was rather surprised to hear from you, Mr. Holmes. You've piqued my curiosity." Holmes gave no immediate response, his eyes scanning the room with his usual intensity. "I'm sure you can appreciate why I have come," Holmes said after a moment, his voice cool and professional. "I have reason to believe that you are connected to a matter of some significance, one involving a certain individual named Mr. Jonathan Stanton." At the mention of Stanton's name, I saw the briefest flicker of emotion cross Ashcombe's face, something sharp and fleeting, but it was gone in an instant. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. He said, his voice tinged with a note of mock consideration. "Mr. Stanton. I believe I knew him, though I can hardly say I was acquainted with him. Well, a man of some ambition, I suppose, though his financial dealings left much to be desired." Holmes did not take the bait. "Mr. Stanton's death," he continued, "was no accident, and I believe it is connected to a ledger one that details a number of debts, some of which you may be intimately familiar with." Ashcombe's eyes hardened ever so slightly, though he maintained his outward composure. "I see," he said slowly. "You are suggesting that I had something to do with Mr. Stanton's unfortunate demise." Holmes tilted his head, considering Ashcombe's words carefully. "Not suggesting, Sir Henry," he replied with quiet certainty. "I am stating that Mr. Stanton's death and his debts are connected, and I believe you hold the key to understanding why." There was a tense silence between them, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Ashcombe studied Holmes for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he stood from his chair and walked toward the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds beyond. The firelight flickered in his eyes, casting fleeting shadows across his face. "I find it rather curious, Mr. Holmes," Ashcombe said, his voice low but steady, "that you would come to my home with such accusations. It seems you have a great deal of confidence, but perhaps you underestimate the forces at play here. I am not a man who takes kindly to being questioned, especially not by those who seem intent on poking around in matters that do not concern them." Holmes did not flinch. He simply observed Ashcombe, his eyes unwavering. "You misunderstand, Sir Henry. I am not here to accuse you of anything, at least, not yet. I am here to find the truth. You are a man of influence, and I suspect that you hold the answers to questions that have eluded us thus far. My only interest is in the facts." Ashcombe turned back to face him, a sly smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Facts," he mused. "I see. Well, Mr. Holmes, I will admit that I do find your persistence admirable, but be warned, there are forces in play that you cannot comprehend. You might think you understand this game, but I assure you, you are only scratching the surface." Holmes' gaze never wavered. "I do not play games, Sir Henry," he replied. "I simply seek the truth, okay? And if that truth leads me to you, then so be it." There was a brief moment of silence before Ashcombe's smile faded, replaced by an expression of something far darker. He stepped closer, his voice now a quiet, almost threatening whisper. "Then you are playing a dangerous game, Mr. Holmes, and I do not take kindly to those who meddle in affairs that are none of their concern." I could feel the tension in the room rise, and for the first time I understood just how perilous our investigation had become. Holmes, however, was unruffled. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I think we've heard enough for now, Sir Henry," Holmes said, his voice calm and controlled. "But rest assured, I will be back. And when I return, I will have the answers I seek." Ashcombe's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing as Holmes turned to leave, motioning for me to follow. As we stepped back into the hallway, I could feel the weight of the encounter pressing down on me. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "It seems, Watson," he said quietly, "that we are closer to the truth than I initially thought. But Ashcombe is not a man to be underestimated. He is playing a far deeper game than we anticipated, he anticipated. I nodded, the unease I had been feeling growing with each passing moment. We had only just begun to peel back the layers of this mystery, and already it was clear that the answers would not come easily. As we left the mansion and made our way back into the fog-shrouded streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now playing by Ashcombe's rules, and I feared that those rules would prove far more dangerous than we had imagined. The days following our visit to Sir Henry Ashcombe's mansion passed with an unsettling quiet. Holmes, as usual, was consumed by the case, but I could see a subtle change in him, an edge of wariness in his movements, a sharpness in his gaze that hinted at the complexity of what we were dealing with. It was as though Ashcombe had cast a shadow over everything, and even Holmes, usually so confident and unshakable, seemed to be navigating a treacherous path. We had learned little from our meeting with Ashcombe, though his veiled threats had spoken volumes. It was clear that he knew far more about the situation than he was willing to admit. He was playing the part of the calm, unruffled gentleman, but his actions had all the signs of a man trying to conceal something that, if revealed, could shatter the delicate balance of power he had worked so hard to maintain. Holmes, ever the meticulous planner, had a new theory about Ashcombe's involvement in Mr. Stanton's death. He was convinced that the key to the entire case lay not in the debt itself, but in the way the debt had been used as a tool for manipulation. It seemed that Ashcombe had orchestrated a situation in which Stanton's financial ruin had been inevitable. Okay, but why go to such lengths? Why ensure that Stanton's debts were so vast, so inescapable, that death seemed the only option? I found myself turning over these questions in my mind as we made our way through the foggy streets of London, the city growing darker with each passing hour. The tension between Holmes and myself had shifted, and unspoken understanding had settled in, and I knew that we were both aware of the peril we faced. Every step we took seemed to bring us closer to a confrontation with forces much greater than we had anticipated. Holmes, as usual, did not share his full thoughts with me, but I could see that he was preparing for something. He had begun to gather information from various sources, speaking with individuals who had ties to Ashcombe's world. I had accompanied him on several of these visits, each one more enigmatic than the last. The more we uncovered about Ashcombe's dealings, the more layers we seemed to peel back, only to find more questions in their place. One afternoon, as we sat in our Baker Street rooms, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the wall as if lost in thought. His brow furrowed slightly, and I knew that he was contemplating the next move. "Watson," he said, breaking the silence with a calmness that betrayed the intensity of his thoughts, "I believe we have been looking at this case from the wrong angle. Ashcombe is clever, yes, but his machinations are not as subtle as we have assumed. He is not a man who hides his actions behind the scenes. He prefers to operate in the open, in plain sight. The key to this mystery lies not in hidden debts or secret ledgers, but in Ashcombe's ego." I looked at him, intrigued. Ego. Holmes nodded slowly. Ashcombe's sense of control is paramount to him. He thrives on the belief that no one can touch him, that he is untouchable, above the law. His reputation, his power, are everything to him. And it is that very ego that has driven him to act so boldly. He does not fear exposure, he welcomes it. The very fact that he allowed us into his home, that he allowed us to question him, is a testament to his belief in his own invulnerability. I processed his words, my mind working through the implications. "So, you believe he wants us to know he's involved in Stanton's death?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He is toying with us, Watson. He wants us to uncover his involvement. But he is not concerned with the truth itself. He is concerned with how we respond to it. His goal is not to remain hidden, but to break us, to force us to acknowledge his superiority. He wants to prove that no matter how much we learn, no matter how hard we try, We will never be able to touch him. The revelation hit me like a thunderclap. Koshkin was playing a dangerous game, one that sought not just to control information, but to control us. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was baiting us into a confrontation, daring us to challenge him. Holmes' face hardened as he continued. And that, Watson, is why we must act quickly. We cannot let him continue to manipulate the narrative. We need to expose him, not just for Stanton's murder, but for the web of influence he has spun around the city. We need to find the evidence that links him directly to the crime. I nodded, understanding the gravity of what we were about to undertake. The case had shifted once again, and this time the stakes were far higher than just solving a murder. We were now dealing with a man who wielded his power like a weapon, and we had to be prepared to face whatever he threw our way. The next step in our investigation led us to a location that was as far removed from Ashcombe's elegant mansion as one could imagine, a dingy warehouse near the river. The building itself was a relic of the industrial age, its brick walls crumbling in places, the windows boarded up to keep the light at bay. It was a place where few would venture, and fewer still would dare to remain. Yet, it was here that Holmes believed we would find the final piece of the puzzle. We arrived under the cover of dusk, the fog once again rolling in from the river, making the atmosphere feel as if the city were disappearing into the mist. Holmes had received word from one of his contacts that something of significance was being stored in the warehouse, something that would prove Ashcombe's involvement in Stanton's death. We approached the building cautiously, our footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Holmes' every movement was deliberate, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. I followed closely behind, feeling the weight of the situation settle over me. This was at the moment of truth. If we were to uncover Ashcombe's secret, we had to do so now. The door to the warehouse creaked as we pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and rusted metal filled my nostrils. Holmes immediately began to move through the shadows, his movements fluid and silent, as though he were one with the darkness itself. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own breath the only thing I could hear. It didn't take long before we found it a small wooden crate tucked away in the farthest corner of the warehouse. Holmes knelt beside it, his fingers tracing the edges of the box as though it were a priceless artifact. With a swift motion, he pried open the lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were several ledgers, exactly the kind of books we had been searching for. But these were not just ordinary financial records. They were Ashcombe's private dealings, names, dates, amounts, and notes that detailed his influence over individuals across the city. But what caught my eye was one particular ledger that stood out from the rest. Holmes opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the pages. "This is it, Watson," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "This is the evidence we've been looking for. Ashcombe's entire operation, laid out in black and white." I looked over his shoulder, my heart racing as I saw the names listed within powerful men. Wealthy families, politicians, each one connected to Ashcombe by a network of debts, favors, and threats. It was all there, the truth laid bare. But as we studied the ledger, I felt a growing sense of dread. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Ashcombe would stop at nothing to protect himself. Now that we had what we needed, there was no turning back. As Holmes closed the ledger, he turned to me with a look of grim determination. "We must go to the authorities, Watson, now, before Ashcombe has a chance to act." And so, with the weight of the truth in our hands, set off once more this time, knowing that the final confrontation with Ashcombe was inevitable. The web of deceit was about to unravel, and we would be there to witness it all. The fog that had thickened over the city the past few days seemed to wrap around us more tightly with every step we took toward the authorities. Holmes was ahead, his stride quick and purposeful, though his expression remained unreadable. I followed, my heart pounding not only with the weight of the ledger in my hands, but with the growing realization that we were moving dangerously close to the final confrontation with Sir Henry Ashcombe. Everything we had uncovered, every piece of evidence led us to this moment. The truth was now undeniable. Ashcombe's influence over London's elite, the network of debts and manipulation, had been laid bare for us. And yet, despite the clarity, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger had yet to reveal itself. Holmes, for all his brilliance, had always been a man who anticipated every possible move. But even he seemed to sense that we were entering a new phase of the game, one where the rules were no longer clear. We made our way to the police station near Scotland Yard. The stone building loomed in front of us, its cold facade, a stark contrast to the warmth of the taverns and homes that dotted the surrounding streets. The air had turned even colder, a biting wind carrying the promise of more rain. Holmes led me through the entrance, the sounds of footsteps echoing down the empty corridors as we made our way to the detective in charge of our case, Inspector Hughes, a seasoned officer with a sharp mind and a reputation for nonsense investigation, seated at his desk when we entered. He looked up as we approached, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had seen his fair share of criminals, and yet I could tell that something about this case had caught his attention from the very start. "Well, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Hughes greeted us, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "I assume you have something substantial for us this time." Holmes did not waste any time. He placed the ledger on the inspector's desk with a decisive thud, and I could see Hughes's eyes narrow as he studied it. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as though the weight of what we had brought to the table was pressing down on all of us. "This is the evidence we've been seeking," Holmes said calmly. "This ledger contains all the financial records and dealings of Sir Henry Ashcombe, names, dates, debts, and more. It's all laid out here, Inspector. This man has been running a network of manipulation and blackmail, with Mr. Jonathan Stanton as just one of his many victims." Hughes took the ledger, flipping through the pages with careful deliberation. The silence stretched between us as he examined the contents, his brow furrowing with each new entry. I could see his mind working, processing the information with an intensity that mirrored Holmes's own. "This is quite the document," Hughes said after a long pause, his voice tinged with disbelief. "And you're certain this is legitimate?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "I have no doubt. Every name, every debt, every transaction is connected to Ashcombe. This ledger is his life's work, the key to understanding how he has managed to control so many influential individuals in this city. This is the proof you need, Inspector. If you act on it, you can bring him to justice." Hughes set the ledger down on the desk, his fingers tapping against the wood as he stared at it, lost in thought. "This is more than we expected," he muttered, almost to himself. "But Ashcombe is a powerful man. He won't go down easily. If he finds out we have this, need to move quickly," Holmes interrupted. "The longer we wait, the more likely it is that Ashcombe will take action to silence anyone who stands in his way." Hughes looked up, meeting Holmes's gaze. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the weight of the decision he was about to make. "Okay, I can't act on this alone, Holmes," he said. "I'll need more than just this ledger. I'll need witnesses, testimonies, concrete proof. Do you have anything else that can tie Ashcombe directly to Stanton's death?" Holmes paused, his gaze unwavering as he considered the question. "I believe we do, Inspector. But it's not a question of evidence. It's a question of timing. We need to act now, before Ashcombe has the chance to cover his tracks. The room grew tense as Hughes weighed the situation. He stood up, his expression hardening into something more resolute. All right, I'll put together a team. We'll need to move quickly, but I won't make any moves without ensuring we have the full support of the law. You'll have my word, Holmes, but be prepared. This is going to get complicated. Holmes nodded, his face a mask of calm determination. Thank you, Inspector. We'll be ready. We left the police station with a sense of urgency in the air, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. The next steps were clear. Hughes would rally his team, and we would work together to bring Ashcombe down. But I could sense something else, something beneath the surface of Holmes's usual confidence. He was still holding something back, some final piece of the puzzle that he had yet to reveal. Holmes, I began as we walked. You've been unusually quiet since our meeting with Hughes. What aren't you telling me? Holmes glanced at me, his expression inscrutable. For a moment, I thought he might dismiss my concern with a wave of his hand, but instead, he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. There's one thing we haven't accounted for, Watson, he said slowly. Ashcombe is not just a man of wealth and influence. He's also a man of ambition. And ambition, when threatened, can be a dangerous thing. We've seen his willingness to manipulate people, to bend them to his will. But what we haven't yet seen is how far he's willing to go to protect his empire. I felt a chill creep down my spine as Holmes's words sank in. We had been so focused on the ledger, on the connections that tied Ashcombe to Stanton's death, that we had neglected to consider just how ruthless Ashcombe could be when cornered. I believe he will strike back, Watson, Holmes continued, his voice lower now. He has too much to lose. And if he feels threatened, he will stop at nothing to ensure that we don't expose him. We have to be prepared for that. I nodded, my mind racing with the implications of his words. We were stepping into a dangerous game, and I could feel the tension mounting. Ashcombe was no longer just a shadow lurking in the background. He was a real threat, and we were getting closer to the moment of reckoning. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I couldn't help but wonder what Ashcombe's next move would be. We had the evidence, and we were ready to act, but I knew that the battle was far from over. The real question now was whether we could outwit Ashcombe before he had the chance to turn the tables on us. We were on the edge of something much larger than we had anticipated. And the only thing that was certain was that the end of this case would come at a price. God, as I lay in bed, the sounds of London's distant hum drifting through the window. I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air outside was thick with fog, and I could almost sense Ashcombe's presence, his influence extending beyond the walls of his mansion and into every corner of the city. The game was far from over, and as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that, whatever came next, it would be the final chapter in this twisted tale. The reckoning had only just begun. The next few days passed with an oppressive tension hanging over us, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Holmes, usually the picture of unwavering focus, seemed even more distant, his thoughts buried in the labyrinth of this case. He barely spoke to me as we waited, his mind consumed by the plan he had in motion. I, on the other hand, was filled with a restless energy. The truth was within our grasp, but so was the danger that awaited us if we moved too hastily. We had managed to gather enough support from Inspector Hughes and his team. The evidence we had unearthed, the ledger, the testimonies, and the connections, was enough to present a clear case against Sir Henry Ashcombe. Yet, something in the back of my mind nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. As Holmes had warned, Ashcombe was a man of power and ambition, and we were about to bring that power crashing down around him. But just as Holmes had anticipated, Ashcombe did not wait for us to make the first move. The suddenness of what happened next left me breathless. It was late one evening when Holmes finally broke his silence. We had been at Baker Street, still, going over the details of our strategy, when he turned to me with a look in his eyes that I knew all too well. It was the look of a man who had just made a critical observation, one that would change everything. "Watson," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I fear we have underestimated Ashcombe. He knows we're closing in on him." Felt a cold chill run down my spine. "How can you be sure?" Holmes stood up, his gaze piercing as he crossed the room to retrieve his coat. "We've been followed, Watson. Several times in the past few days. I suspected as much, but now I have proof." I stared at him, my mind racing. We had been careful, hadn't we? We had taken every precaution to avoid detection, ensuring that no one knew the full extent of our investigation. And yet, somehow, Ashcombe had found a way to track us. He was not just a passive figure in this game, he was playing it with all, the cunning of a master strategist, anticipating our every move. "We need to act, and quickly," Holmes continued, pulling his coat on with practiced efficiency. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Ashcombe is already preparing for the inevitable confrontation. We must be ready for whatever he throws at us." I nodded, feeling a sense of urgency rise within me. I had always known that we were playing a game of cat and mouse, but now the stakes felt higher than ever. Ashcombe was no longer just a man we were investigating. He had become a direct threat to our lives. "We'll need to be one step ahead of him," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward me. "Police are ready to move, but I'm afraid they won't be able to act in time. We need to gather the final pieces of the puzzle, Watson. We need to know everything about Ashcombe's network, his influence, his backers." As he spoke, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead of us. We were no longer just uncovering the truth. We were about to confront a man who had built his empire on lies, manipulation, and threats. Ashcombe had more to lose than we had initially realized, and I feared that the lengths he would go to protect himself would be beyond anything we had anticipated. We spent the next few hours revisiting the information we had gathered. Holmes was methodical in his approach, his sharp mind running through every detail of the case, searching for something we might have missed. I could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes as he mentally connected the dots, tracing the paths that led back to Ashcombe's control. At around midnight, just as we were about to leave for our final meeting with Inspector Hughes, the knock came. It was soft, almost too soft, but it was unmistakable. Holmes motioned for me to stay back, his eyes scanning the shadows of the room. He approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering near the handle. For a moment, everything was still, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air. "Who is it?" Holmes called, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. There was no response. Holmes' eyes narrowed. With a swift motion, he turned the handle and pulled the door open, only to find the hallway empty. I stepped forward, glancing around. "No one's there," I said, feeling the unease settle deep in my gut. Holmes' expression was unreadable as he stepped back into the room. "It's a warning, Watson. Ashcombe knows we're close. He's sending us a message." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What does it mean?" Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line. "It means that Ashcombe is making his move, and if we don't act quickly, we'll be too late." The following morning, the full weight of our situation hit us. We had planned to meet with Inspector Hughes to finalize our strategy, but the city felt different. The streets were quieter, the air thick with tension. I felt as though we were walking through a trap, our every move being monitored by unseen eyes. Holmes, as usual, was the picture of calm efficiency, but I could see the tension beneath his composed exterior. He knew, as I did, that we were no longer dealing with a simple case of murder and deception. We were tangled in a far larger web spun by a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his hold on power. We arrived at Scotland Yard to find that the situation had already escalated. Inspector Hughes was waiting for us in his office, his face grim. "Holmes, Watson," Hughes said, without preamble, "we've received word that Ashcombe is preparing to leave London. His assets are being moved, and we suspect he's planning to disappear." Holmes stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "So, it's true. He knows we're coming for him." Hughes nodded. "It's not just the assets. We've intercepted messages that suggest Ashcombe has arranged for his escape. He's making final preparations." I felt the weight of the moment press down on me. Ashcombe was not simply hiding. He was preparing to vanish, to erase himself from the face of the earth. And we were on the cusp of losing him forever. "We can't let him get away," Holmes said, his voice low and filled with a deadly certainty. Hughes looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "What do you need from us?" Holmes' gaze was fixed on the inspector. "We need to move fast. I'll take the lead on this, but I'll need your team's full support. We need to find Ashcombe before he disappears. Once he's gone, it's over." The room fell silent as the weight of his words hung in the air. This was it, the final move in the game. We were about to go after a man who had planned for every contingency, who had built his empire on a foundation of lies and manipulation. But it was not just Ashcombe's empire that was at stake now, okay? It was our own. The city seemed to hold its breath as we moved forward with our plan to corner Sir Henry Ashcombe. Holmes was as resolute as ever, but I could see the undercurrent of tension that ran through his every movement. The night before, we had spoken little, each of us too absorbed in our thoughts to engage in idle conversation. There was a quiet urgency in the air now, an understanding that this moment would determine the fate of everything we had uncovered. We had acted quickly, pulling together all the pieces of the puzzle we had gathered over the past weeks. Holmes had used every resource at his disposal to track Ashcombe's movements. But as we soon discovered, the elusive aristocrat had taken measures to hide his whereabouts. Our investigation into his sudden plans for departure had led us to a single lead. Ashcombe's departure from London was imminent, and the critical information that could link him directly to the crimes was hidden within his private estate. The stakes had never been higher. The ledger was proof of Ashcombe's vast network of corruption and manipulation. Yet Ashcombe had planned to slip away before we could expose the full extent of his empire. Holmes and I had no time to waste. If Ashcombe vanished without facing justice, the power he wielded would remain unchecked, and all our efforts would have been in vain. We had set our course for Ashcombe's private residence in the early morning, hours before he could make his escape. The mansion was situated on a sprawling estate on the outskirts of London, far removed from the busy streets of the city, nestled within a dense thicket of trees that made it nearly invisible from the outside. The grounds were heavily guarded, but Holmes had already anticipated this. He had worked out the security arrangements with surgical precision, leaving nothing to chance. As we approached the mansion in a carriage driven by one of Holmes' most trusted men, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if the very air we breathed was charged with the electricity of an impending storm. I glanced over at Holmes, who was watching the estate through the small window, his gaze distant, calculating. He had not spoken much in the past few hours, his mind consumed by the steps we were about to take. "Do you believe we'll catch him, Holmes?" I asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. Holmes turned his eyes to me, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of something uncertainty, perhaps before it was gone. "If anyone can find him, Watson, it's us, but I cannot say with certainty that we will catch him before he slips away. Ashcombe is a man who thrives on control. His every move is deliberate, and we are mere pawns in his game." I couldn't help but feel a weight settle over me as we neared the mansion. The game had always been about control, but it was clear now that we were no longer the ones in charge. Ashcombe had played us, luring us deeper into his web with every step we took. The carriage came to a halt at the edge of the estate, and we made our way toward the mansion under the cover of darkness. Holmes had arranged for a small group of detectives to meet us at a discreet location, ready to move in as soon as we had secured Ashcombe's whereabouts. The mansion loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The stone walls were high, and the windows darkened, offering no hint of what lay inside. As we approached the mansion, I noticed a faint light flickering through the cracks in one of the windows, and I felt a shiver of recognition. Holmes' mind was already working through the possible scenarios. "He's here," he muttered under his breath. "We're not too late." I followed closely as we moved toward the back of the mansion, where a hidden entrance led to the servants' quarters. Holmes' eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, as if trying to anticipate the next move. He was poised, ready for action, but there was no rush in his steps, only calculated determination. We had been in this situation before, but this time, the tension was palpable. This was no longer just a case, it was a race against time. As we made our way through the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion, I felt the cold weight of the impending confrontation. Every step we took brought us closer to Ashcombe, and yet, with each passing moment, the walls seemed to close in on us. The house was eerily quiet, its silence broken only by the faintest creaks of wood beneath our feet. The air felt thick with the remnants of the secrets Ashcombe had carefully concealed. Holmes paused before a door at the end of the hallway, his hand resting on the knob. "This is it," he said quietly. "We'll find him inside." I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. We had no idea what awaited us on the other side of the door. Ashcombe was a man who had made his life from keeping secrets, from manipulating those around him. We had already seen how far he was willing to go to protect himself, but what would he do now when the truth was within reach? With a steady hand, Holmes turned the knob, and we stepped into the room. The dim light from a solitary candle illuminated a large, lavish study filled with dark mahogany furniture and shelves lined with books. At the center of the room was Ashcombe, standing with his back to us, staring out the window toward the darkened grounds. He was dressed in his usual impeccable suit, but there was a tension in the air that made him seem different, more dangerous. "Somehow, you're too late, Mr. Holmes," Ashcombe said without turning, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I knew you would come, but the question is, what will you do once you have found me?" Holmes took a step forward, his gaze locked on Ashcombe's back. "I'll do what I must, Sir Henry," he said quietly. "I will expose you for what you are, and I will bring you to justice." Tom turned slowly, a cold smile on his lips. "You think you can stop me, do you? I have spent my entire life building this empire, Mr. Holmes. I've manipulated, controlled, and crushed anyone who dared to stand in my way. You were no different." Holmes did not flinch. "Your empire is built on lies, Ashcombe, and it's crumbling." For a moment, there was silence. Ashcombe's smile faltered, just for the briefest second before he regained his composure. "You're a fool if you think you can defeat me. But I suppose that's what makes this so interesting." The tension in the room was unbearable. Ashcombe's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Holmes to make the first move. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on us, and for the first time, I wondered if we had underestimated just how dangerous Ashcombe truly was. Without warning, Ashcombe reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, ornate pistol, the cold gleam of the metal catching the candlelight. He leveled it at Holmes with a steady hand, his eyes gleaming with something far darker than mere confidence. "I've been playing this game for much longer than you realize, Holmes," Ashcombe said, his voice cold and final. "And now it's my turn to win." Gad, ad, guess, But Holmes, ever the strategist, stood unmoved. He didn't flinch, didn't back away. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Ashcombe, calculating, waiting for the right moment to act. And I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that this battle wasn't over. The game had only just begun. The muzzle of the pistol gleamed in the dim light, its cold, unforgiving presence casting a shadow over the room. Sir Henry Ashcombe stood perfectly still, his fingers wrapped around the trigger with a calm that sent a ripple of unease through me. His eyes locked onto Holmes with a chilling intensity, and for a moment I could see the years of manipulation and control etched into every line of his face. Holmes, however, remained unperturbed, his gaze steady, as though the gun before him was nothing more than an inconvenience. There was no fear in his eyes, only the sharpness of a man who had faced far worse dangers and come out unscathed. His hand remained at his side, and I could sense the calculating precision that was always present in his demeanor, even in the face of such immediate peril. "Do you honestly believe that you can intimidate me with that, Ashcombe?" Holmes spoke, his voice low but unwavering. "You have no more power over me now than you had over Mr. Stanton." Ashcombe's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was little humor in it. "You misunderstand, Holmes. It's not about intimidation, it's about control. I have spent my life building this empire, shaping the world around me, and now, with one simple pull of the trigger, I can destroy everything you've worked for." Holmes tilted his head slightly, his expression almost contemplative. "Is that what this is about, Sir Henry? Control? Power? You've already lost, and you don't even realize it." The air between us thickened, the tension so palpable, it felt like it could suffocate us at any moment. I found myself holding my breath, unable to move, unable to think. The entire room seemed to close in, and the weight of the moment was suffocating. The choice before us was stark and unforgiving. Ashcombe had the power to end our investigation, to silence us both with a single movement. The ledger, our entire case, was now at his mercy. And yet, there was something in Holmes's eyes, something that suggested he was more than ready to turn the tables on Ashcombe. "You think I've lost?" Holmes scoffed, the smile on his face widening slightly. "You're delusional, Holmes. You're nothing but a pawn in a much larger game. You think you can expose me, bring me down, but you've only played right into my hands. You have no idea how deep this goes. You think you've cracked the surface, but what you've uncovered is just a small part of what's really at play here." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly, and I could see the sharpness of his mind at work. He was processing, calculating, seeking a way out. But not just any way that would expose Ashcombe for the man he truly was. "Your arrogance blinds you, Ashcombe," Holmes said, his voice calm but resolute. "You've built your empire on the suffering of others, on the manipulation of those who trusted you. But you've underestimated one thing. You've underestimated the power of truth." Ashcombe's eyes darkened, the smile vanishing entirely. "You think truth will save you? Truth doesn't matter in a world like this. People don't care about the truth, Holmes. They care about power. They care about who controls the narrative." Holmes took a step forward, his expression never wavering. "No, they care about what's real, and what's real is that you've been caught, Sir Henry. Your network, your influence, everything you've built unraveling. You can't control the truth, and you certainly can't control me." For the first time since entering the room, Ashcombe's hand trembled Slightly. I caught the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Holmes had done it again. He had found a chink in Ashcombe's armor. A man who had spent his life controlling others was, in this moment, losing his grip. And that was when I saw it just for a split second. A flash of movement at the corner of the room. Before I could even process what had happened, a figure emerged from the shadows. Another man, moving swiftly toward Ashcombe. The room exploded into action as the figure grabbed Ashcombe's arm, knocking the gun from his hand in a single, well-executed move. Ashcombe staggered back, shocked, as his weapon clattered to the floor. The newcomer stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, eyes focused on Ashcombe with a fierce determination. This was one of Holmes's trusted contacts, a man named Roderick, who had been shadowing us in the background, anticipating Ashcombe's move. Holmes had known that Ashcombe would not give up easily, and he had prepared for this moment. Roderick said, with a cold sneer. Your reign ends here. Ashcombe's face contorted with rage, but there was nothing he could do. The game was up. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time he seemed to realize just how vulnerable he truly was. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Ashcombe as he gathered himself. It's over, Sir Henry. The truth will be exposed. Your empire will fall, and your crimes will be brought to light. Ashcombe's expression shifted, the arrogance giving way to something darker, something far more dangerous. You think this is over, Holmes? You've made a grave mistake. This is just the beginning. Holmes remained unmoved, his face a mask of calm. You've made the mistake of thinking that power and control will always keep you safe. But truth has a way of catching up with even the most powerful men, and it's caught up with you. The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the city beyond the walls of Ashcombe's mansion. Stood there, watching the scene unfold as everything we had worked for the long nights of investigation. The pursuit of the truth came to its inevitable conclusion. Ashcombe's eyes flickered toward the door, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. But he knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The walls were closing in, and his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. Jesus. Not over, Holmes, he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. You have no idea what you've done. The people I've worked with, they won't let you expose me. You think you've won, but you're wrong. Holmes stood tall, his gaze unwavering. I've already won, Sir Henry. The moment you underestimated me, the moment you let your arrogance take over, you lost. With that, Holmes turned and motioned for Roderick to escort Ashcombe out of the room. The authorities were already on their way, and the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Ashcombe's empire was finished, and the truth would soon be made known to the world. As Roderick led Ashcombe away, Holmes turned to me, his expression softening for the first time since we had entered the mansion. It's done, Watson. The game is over. I nodded, the weight of the past weeks settling on my shoulders. The pursuit of truth had brought us to this point, and we had emerged victorious. I understand. But what you're asking for, Holmes, this isn't just a few corrupt businessmen. This goes much deeper. We're talking about the highest levels of power in London. No, Holmes replied. Yes, but if we don't act now, it will be too late. Ashcombe's influence is the tip of the iceberg. And if we don't expose everything now, this city will remain in the hands of those who will do anything to keep their secrets hidden. Hughes was quiet for a moment, weighing Holmes's words. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, Holmes, you've convinced me. I'll have my team start working on these names. We'll bring in everyone we can. Holmes's eyes flickered with a brief glimmer of satisfaction, but it quickly disappeared. Make sure you do this carefully, Inspector. The people involved in this are far more dangerous than they appear. They will stop at nothing to protect their interests. We left the station. I could feel the weight of the case pressing down on us even more. Ashcombe's empire might have been crumbling, but the people who had benefited from his manipulation were still in power, and they would fight to keep their secrets buried. Holmes, as always, was resolute, but even he knew that the final battle was not yet won. The game had changed, and the stakes had risen higher than either of us could have anticipated. The truth, it seemed, was more complicated and more dangerous than we had ever imagined. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood by the window, his eyes focused on the horizon, the fog thickening outside. I knew that he was already plotting our next move, already considering the steps we would need to take to root out the rest of the corruption that still lay beneath the surface. But for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his expression. This case, this web of deceit and power, had proven to be more complex than he had initially thought. And in his world, complexity often meant danger. "The work is far from finished, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "But we've come too far to turn back now." And I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that we would see this through to the end, no matter what it took. The days that followed were marked by a strange sense of urgency that gripped Holmes more tightly than I had ever seen before. The mystery, though seemingly close to resolution, was proving to be far more tangled than either of us could have anticipated. Holmes had always prided himself on his ability to bring clarity to even the most convoluted of cases, but this network of corruption and manipulation that stretched far beyond Sir Henry Ashcombe's reach seemed to slip through his fingers at every turn, and I could sense that Holmes, despite his outward composure, was beginning to feel the weight of it. We had made progress. Inspector Hughes had mobilized his team to begin investigating the names in the ledger. The connections we had unearthed between Ashcombe and some of the city's most influential figures had sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. But even as we inched closer to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy, there was an ever-growing sense that the real threat lay just beyond our reach. Ashcombe, though detained, had made it clear that his downfall would not come without a fight, and the people who had worked alongside him, those who had built their own empires atop the ruin of others, would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Holmes's investigation, while thorough, was now taking him into murkier waters. He had begun to focus on the key players who had been linked to Ashcombe's dealings to powerful businessmen, the politicians, the lawmen whose names appeared repeatedly in the ledger. But every new lead seemed to raise more questions, and each question led to a new trail that seemed to vanish before we could follow it to its conclusion. It was early one morning when Holmes arrived at Baker Street, his face drawn with the exhaustion of sleepless nights spent piecing together the puzzle. I had been reading through some of the documents we had collected, my mind racing with the same troubling thoughts. When Holmes strode into the room, his coat flapping behind him, there was a look in his eyes, a glimmer of something new. Something that told me he had uncovered a thread that could unravel the entire case. "We're getting closer, Watson," Holmes said, his voice as sharp as ever, but with an edge that I hadn't heard in days. "But there's still one piece we're missing, one name that has eluded us." I set the papers down and turned to face him, my curiosity piqued. "What name?" Holmes glanced at me, a brief flicker of hesitation crossing his features. Before he spoke, Lady Margaret Ashcombe. The name hung in the air between us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard of Lady Margaret, the wife of Sir Henry Ashcombe. She had always maintained a low profile in society, rarely seen at the events that Ashcombe frequented, but her name had appeared in the ledger several times, always in connection with a series of cryptic notes. The connection had been fleeting, but Holmes had clearly seen something in it that I had missed. "Lady Margaret?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. But she's never been involved in any of the dealings that we've uncovered. Why would she be important now? Holmes stood still for a moment, his eyes distant as he pieced the information together in his mind. That's just it, Watson. He's been overlooked by me, by Ashcombe, by everyone, but I think that's exactly what she wanted. She's been hiding in plain sight. I felt my brow furrow as I tried to follow Holmes's train of thought. Hiding, but surely she would have known that her husband's empire would eventually fall apart. Why wouldn't she have distanced herself from it? Holmes shook his head. Because, Watson, Lady Margaret is not just a passive figure in all of this. She's been orchestrating the entire thing. Ashcombe's empire was built on manipulation, but it was Lady Margaret who ensured that it would last. She has connections, of her own ones, that go far deeper than her husband's. We've been chasing shadows for too long, Watson. It's time we focused on her. I leaned forward, absorbing the weight of Holmes's words. But why hasn't she been more directly involved? Why hasn't she been more visible? That's exactly why we missed her, Holmes replied, his eyes now alight with the excitement of discovery. She's the architect behind the curtain, pulling the strings while Ashcombe played the public figure. She's the one who arranged the most covert deals, the one who built the network in silence. All of Ashcombe's power was always hers to command. I could see now that Holmes's theory was gaining strength. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Lady Margaret's apparent passivity had been a smokescreen, a way to avoid suspicion while operating behind the scenes. She had always been in control, using her influence subtly but decisively to ensure Ashcombe's empire remained intact. Where do we start? I asked, eager to follow this new thread. Holmes's eyes glinted. We find her, Watson, and we see what she's been hiding. The search for Lady Margaret Ashcombe led us to the quiet, secluded corner of London where the Ashcombe estate sat, an imposing building nestled among manicured gardens that hid the secrets of a family whose influence ran deeper than we had ever imagined. Holmes's plan was simple. We would observe from a distance, waiting for a sign of her movement, and then make our move when the time was right. Hours passed in relative silence as we waited, our eyes trained on the estate. It was then, just as dusk was settling over the city, that we saw Ida's figure moving toward the back of the house, flanked by two shadowy figures. Holmes's sharp eyes never wavered as he leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. There she is, he said, his fingers twitching in anticipation. Lady Margaret. Watch closely, my heart racing. The woman who had been hidden in the shadows for so long was finally stepping into the light, and it was clear from her demeanor that she was no mere figurehead. She was as calculating and as dangerous as her husband had ever been. Holmes turned. To me, his face a mixture of determination and grim resolution. Now, Watson, we follow her. As we shadowed Lady Margaret, moving quietly through the streets, the weight of what was happening settled over me. We were no longer just uncovering the truth about Ashcombe. We were chasing a shade of a woman who had built her own empire of influence and manipulation. Every step we took felt like it was leading us deeper into the heart of something much larger than we had anticipated. Holmes' strategy was clear. We would confront her, force her into revealing the full extent of her involvement, and expose the entire network that had been operating under the surface of London's elite society. But as the hours stretched on and we drew closer to our goal, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Margaret was more than just another player in this twisted game. She was the final piece of the puzzle, and if we weren't careful, she would be the one to slip away. Stay close, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice low as we approached a narrow alleyway where Lady Margaret had disappeared. This is where it all comes together. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the final act was about to begin. The truth we had sought for so long was within our grasp, but so, too, was the danger that had been lurking in the shadows all along. We moved through the streets of London like shadows, our footsteps muffled by the quiet of the night. The heavy fog had settled in once more, clinging to the buildings and seeping into the alleyways, obscuring everything in a dense veil of gray. It was in this silence that we followed Lady Margaret, a figure now more elusive than ever, yet one we were determined to corner. She had led us through winding streets, through forgotten corners of the city, and into a world that seemed to exist just outside of the reality we knew. Holmes's eyes were fixed ahead, his mind clearly working through every possibility. He had already pieced together her importance, but there was still something about her movements that kept us on edge. She was careful, almost too careful. Her path was deliberate, calculated, and it was clear that she knew she was being followed. "Do you think she's aware of us?" I whispered to Holmes, who had remained quiet since we'd first set out to follow her. Holmes barely acknowledged me, his gaze unwavering. "It's likely," he said softly. "Lady Margaret has always been more perceptive than most. But we cannot afford to falter now. She is the last piece of this puzzle, Watson." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. If we could confront her, force her to reveal her connections to Ashcombe's empire, then everything would fall into place. But if she managed to escape us, if she slipped away as Ashcombe had done before, then the entire investigation would have been for naught. We followed her into a narrow alleyway, one that seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the shadows. The alley itself was old, lined with dilapidated buildings whose windows had long since been boarded up. The sense of isolation in this part of the city was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. Holmes motioned for me to stop, his hand raised to signal caution. He was listening, waiting for something. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of the wind through the fog. Jenna heard it? The faintest of footsteps, quick, purposeful, coming toward us from the direction we had just come from. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that we were not the only ones in pursuit. Lady Margaret had likely anticipated our every move, and we were now walking directly into her web. Holmes turned, his face a mask of concentration. "We're not alone, Watson. They've set a trap for us." Before I could react, Holmes motioned for me to follow him. We had no choice but to move quickly, ducking into a doorway to our left, just as a group of shadowy figures appeared at the far end of the alley. They were moving quickly, their steps deliberate and coordinated. There was no mistaking it. These were not ordinary thugs. These were people who had been trained to move with purpose, to take down anyone who got in their way. "We need to act fast," Holmes muttered under his breath. "They've been waiting for us." We crouched low, our breaths shallow as the figures drew closer. The sound of their footsteps grew louder until the silence was broken only by the soft shuffle of their shoes on the cobblestones. Holmes's mind was already working, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was calculating our next move, his eyes scanning the environment for any advantage we could use. Then, as if on cue, Lady Margaret's voice rang out from the end of the alley, sharp and cold. "You're too late, Mr. Holmes," she called, her tone laced with a hint of amusement. "I thought you'd be smarter than this." Holmes straightened, his jaw tightening as he turned toward her. "Lady Margaret," he said, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. "I knew you were the one behind this all along." She stepped forward, her silhouette emerging from the fog like a ghost. She was dressed in black, her face partially obscured by a veil, but there was no mistaking the confidence in her posture. She had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, orchestrating everything with a masterful hand. "You've underestimated me, Holmes," she said, her voice growing more assured with each step she took. "You thought you could expose my husband, tear down his empire, but you've only discovered a small piece of the larger picture. Ashcombe was a tool, nothing more. He never understood the true scope of what we built together. I watched as Holmes's eyes flickered, a faint hint of recognition dawning on him. "You were the architect of this entire operation," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "All along, you were the one pulling the strings. I was merely your puppet." Lady Margaret's lips curled into a smile, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something darker in her eyes. Yes, Ashcombe was useful, but he was always flawed. I knew from the start that I needed more than his bluster and charm. I needed someone who could maintain control, someone who could remain in the shadows while the world focused on him. I knew I could use him to build the empire, and I'd be the one to make sure it stayed intact. Holmes stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "You've manipulated everyone, Lady Margaret. The entire city has been under your control, and yet you never once questioned your methods, did you? You were always willing to sacrifice others for your own gain." She laughed, the sound sharp and cold. "Sacrifice? No, Mr. Holmes. I don't sacrifice people. I use them, I shape them, and I make them work for me. Everyone has their price, and if they don't, they're disposed of." I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. The ruthlessness with which she spoke, the casual way she described her machinations, it was all too real, too terrifying. She had built a world of power and influence so deeply entrenched that it was impossible to pull apart. And now, it seemed, we were facing the full force of her reach. "We're not done yet, Lady Margaret," Holmes said, his voice now low and filled with determination. "You may think you've won, but the truth is already out. Your empire may have been built in shadows, but the light is breaking through. Your web is unraveling." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she regarded Holmes. "You really think so?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "You've exposed a fraction of the truth, but the real game is much more complex than you can imagine. You think Ashcombe was the problem? You're wrong. The people I work with, the ones who've helped me build this empire, they won't let you destroy everything we've created. You've only scratched the surface." Holmes's gaze hardened, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker. In his eyes a quiet resolve, the kind that came only with the knowledge that the end was near, and there was no turning back. "We'll see, Lady Margaret," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We'll see just how far your empire stretches." The fog pressed in around us, but Holmes remained unwavering, his mind already working through the next steps. The game had changed again, but this time we were ready. The threads were finally beginning to unravel, and, with Lady Margaret at the center of it all, the final confrontation was inevitable. The truth was out there, and no matter how deeply she tried to bury it, we would expose it. Ashcombe's empire, her empire, was on the verge of collapse, and this time there would be no escape. The tension in the alley was thick with danger, the air charged with anticipation. Lady Margaret's smug expression never wavered, and it was clear she believed she had the upper hand. But Holmes, standing before her, was unflinching. The light from the gas lamps flickered in his eyes, casting a shadow over his usually calm demeanor. He was different now, his posture betraying a sense of urgency and readiness, as though he were preparing for something far more than a mere confrontation. I stood by his side, my heart racing as I tried to process the enormity of what had just unfolded. Lady Margaret Ashcombe, the elusive figure who had been hiding behind the curtains of her husband's empire, is now revealed as the true mastermind. Her ability to manipulate everyone in her path had been her strength, but it was also her downfall. "You're right," Holmes finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The game was never about Ashcombe. It was about you, Lady Margaret. You orchestrated everything from the shadows. You built your empire on lies, power, and manipulation, and you thought no one would ever catch you." She smiled, a twisted, almost pitying look on her face. "You have no idea, Holmes. No idea how much I've sacrificed to keep everything in place. Ashcombe was a tool, a means to an end. But I've always been in control." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment I could see the mask of confidence begin to crack. There was something cold in her eyes now, something raw and unhinged. For the first time, I saw the woman behind the masks, someone who was more dangerous than I had ever imagined. "You never intended for Ashcombe to take the fall, did you? Did you?" I asked, stepping forward. "You let him believe he was the one in control while you pulled the strings all along." Her lips curled into a tight smile, and I could see a flicker of frustration behind her composure. "What you don't understand, Dr. Watson, is that the power I wield has nothing to do with Ashcombe. It's about understanding people, what they want, what they fear. I knew how to use him, how to manipulate everyone around me. That's why they all trusted me." Holmes regarded her silently for a moment, his mind clearly at work. He had seen through her false veneer long before I had. The idea that Lady Margaret, a woman who had stayed in the background for so long, had built such a vast network of influence was a revelation, but one that explained everything we had uncovered about Ashcombe's empire. She was the one who had made it all happen, carefully constructing a system of control that stretched into every facet of society. "But that's where you're wrong," Holmes said, his voice cold. "You may have controlled the strings for a time, but you've forgotten something important. People like you always make one mistake. They believe they're invincible. They believe they can control the narrative forever. But the truth has a way of exposing even the deepest shadows." Her expression darkened, and the veil of arrogance that had defined her began to slip. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You've only scratched the surface. You have no idea who I've been working with. The people I know. Your little investigation is nothing compared to what they're capable of. You've made enemies you can't even fathom." I could hear the edge in her voice now, a desperation seeping through the cracks. It was clear she was not as unshakable as she had tried to appear. For the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes, fear of losing control, fear of being exposed. Holmes took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared her down. "You've underestimated me, Lady Margaret. It's not about the people you know or the network you've built. It's about the truth, okay? And the truth is something you can't control." A tense silence hung between us, and I could feel the weight of everything we had fought for, everything we had uncovered in that moment. Lady Margaret's empire, her manipulation, her carefully orchestrated web of power was crumbling before her eyes. "You may have thought you could outrun the consequences," Holmes continued, his voice steady, "but you're wrong. You can't hide anymore. The truth is already out there, and soon the entire city will know what you've done." Lady Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white from the pressure. "You think you've won, Holmes," she spat, "but you don't understand. This is just the beginning. The people who helped me, those I've worked with, they'll never let you take me down. You'll never expose them." Holmes took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on her. "God, the people you've been working with won't be able to protect you. Not this time. You're done, Lady Margaret. You've played your game, but now the pieces are falling apart." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley. I turned to see a group of men approaching from the far end, detectives led by Inspector Hughes. They had arrived, as we had planned, to ensure that Lady Margaret could not escape. But even as they moved toward us, I could see the determination in Holmes's eyes. This wasn't just about arresting her. It was about securing everything we had worked for. "Lady Margaret Ashcombe," Holmes called, his voice authoritative. "You are under arrest for your involvement in the crimes committed by Sir Henry Ashcombe and his network. You have the right to remain silent. For a brief moment, there was no movement. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered between Holmes, the approaching detectives, and the shadows around us. I could see the fight in her, the will to escape, to slip through the cracks one last time. But she was beaten. The game was over. "I think you've lost, Lady Margaret," Holmes said, his voice filled with the quiet confidence that only he possessed. "You may have thought you controlled everything, but you never accounted for the truth, and the truth always catches up with you." She stood there, frozen for a moment, as if considering her options. Then, slowly, her shoulders sagged, and the fight seemed to leave her. The facade of control, the image she had so carefully cultivated, shattered before our eyes. The detectives moved in, quickly securing her and escorting her away. As they led her toward the waiting carriage, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. The investigation, the chase, the countless hours of work was all coming to an end. But there was something else, too, a lingering feeling that we had uncovered only a small part of the story. Ashcombe's downfall had been inevitable, but Lady Margaret's capture was just the first step. The full extent of her network would take time to unravel. Holmes turned to me, his face set in its usual calm expression, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. "It's done, Watson, but it's not over yet. There are still others out there, others who will do everything they can to ensure the truth never sees the light of day." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The game was over for Lady Margaret, but the battle was far from won. There would be more work to do, more pieces to uncover, and more people to expose. But for now, we had won this part of the fight. As the fog thickened around us and the city settled into the quiet of the night, I knew one thing for certain. The truth had finally been exposed, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed Lady Margaret Ashcombe's arrest felt both surreal and anticlimactic. The weight of our success was finally unmasking the true architect behind Ashcombe's vast empire of manipulation and control. Should have been a cause for celebration. But instead, I found myself staring out of the window at the fog that seemed to cling to the city like an inescapable truth. The streets of London, though bustling with life, felt eerily quiet, as though the shadows we had chased for so long still lingered in the corners of every alleyway. Holmes, ever the stoic figure, had returned to his usual routine, though I could see the strain in his eyes. The case had taken a toll on him, as it had on all of us, but he was not one to dwell on emotions. His mind, always sharp and calculating, was already focused on the next challenge. Even as Lady Margaret was processed through the courts, with the police securing her connections and beginning the slow unraveling of her network, Holmes seemed to have shifted his focus to something deeper, something that had not yet come to light. It was late one evening, a few days after Lady Margaret's arrest, when Holmes finally spoke of the lingering thoughts that had been occupying his mind. We were sitting in our shared rooms at Baker Street, the fireplace casting a soft glow across the room, the only sound, the crackling of the logs as we both sat in silence. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice low, as though he was speaking to himself rather than to me. "There's something we have yet to understand about this whole case, something that keeps bothering me." I glanced over at him, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Conned." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as his piercing gaze met mine. "It's not just about Ashcombe or Lady Margaret. It's not even just about the network they've built. It's about the foundation, the people who have been complicit in this, those who have supported. Connor's rise and Lady Margaret's manipulation are not simply figures in the background. They are the ones who built the system, who made it work, and they are still out there." Sat back in my chair, absorbing his words. "You believe there are others still involved?" Holmes nodded slowly, his expression serious. Lady Margaret and Ashcombe were the faces of the operation, but they were always backed by a web of influential people, powerful individuals who remain untouchable for now, and it is they who will seek to ensure that the truth is buried. The arrest of Lady Margaret, while significant, is only one piece of the puzzle. There is a much larger network to uncover. I felt a pang of frustration settle in my chest. How do we find them? After everything we've uncovered, the people who remain in the shadows seem far more elusive than Ashcombe ever was. Holmes paused for a moment, considering my words. Then, as if the answer had always been there, he spoke again. We don't seek them out directly, we wait. The truth has already begun to spread. As it does, those who have relied on secrecy and corruption will be forced into the open. They will make a mistake. People like them always do. Think when they do, Watson, we'll be ready. I nodded, but doubt still lingered in my mind. The truth was, while Holmes had an uncanny ability to foresee events, the scale of what we had uncovered left me with an unsettling sense of unfinished business. Lady Margaret's arrest had been a victory, but it felt like a victory over the symptom, not the disease itself. There was more to be done, more to be uncovered. Over the following weeks, the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place. The public's awareness of Ashcombe's empire had begun to spread. And as it did, the web of individuals who had been complicit in his schemes slowly started to unravel. Investigations into Ashcombe's finances, his associations, and his dealings with the city's elite had opened a door to a wider, more corrupt world than anyone had anticipated. Some of the names from the ledger had already begun to appear. In the papers, businessmen, politicians, even members of law enforcement teach one trying to distance themselves from Ashcombe's legacy, but not without their secrets being dragged into the light. Holmes had kept a careful watch over the situation, his connections with the press and the authorities ensuring that the information we had uncovered continued to circulate. Oh God, even as the net tightened around the corrupt officials and figures who had supported Ashcombe and Lady Margaret, Holmes remained ever vigilant, knowing full well that this was only the beginning. There's more at stake here, Watson, he said one afternoon as we sat over tea, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the edge of his cup. What we've uncovered goes far beyond just one man's empire. It's a question of the system itself, the way power has been structured in this city. Kaj and Lady Margaret are merely the symptoms of a much deeper disease. The real work will come when we begin to expose those who have enabled them to thrive. I watched him carefully, wondering if the weight of the case was beginning to wear on him. Holmes, it seemed, never truly rested. His mind was constantly in motion, calculating, analyzing, never content to simply accept what had been uncovered. This was both his greatest strength and his most burdensome trait. The problem, Watson, Holmes continued, is that corruption like this is systemic. It's not about one figurehead. It's about the people who support that figurehead, who profit from the system of control. Until they are exposed, nothing will change. Are you suggesting we've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg? Okay, I asked, still reeling from the scope of what we had already discovered. Holmes looked at me with that familiar gleam in his eyes, the one that told me he had already planned his next move. Indeed, Watson, what we've uncovered is just the beginning. The real challenge lies ahead, the challenge of bringing down the system itself. Ain't that, my friend, will require more than just evidence. Hate will require people who are willing to stand up and fight. As the weeks wore on, I began to see the true extent of what Holmes had meant. More names came to light, more individuals whose involvement in Ashcombe's schemes could no longer be hidden. The truth was like a slow-moving tide, and as it spread, it began to erode the very foundation of the system Ashcombe had helped create. But I also began to understand the price that would have to be paid. The people we had exposed were not going to go quietly. They had the power to resist, to fight back. And in the quiet moments between our work, when Holmes would disappear into his thoughts, I began to realize something else. This pursuit of truth was not simply about exposing a corrupt system. It was about revealing the darkness that had festered beneath the surface of society for so long. The game had changed, and we were no longer just detectives seeking answers. We were part of something far larger, something that would leave a lasting impact on the city we called home. Holmes's work was far from finished. The legacy of Ashcombe, Lady Margaret, and the web of corruption they had spun would take time to dismantle us. But as the final pieces of the case fell into place, I knew that the city would never be the same again. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. The legacy of shadows had finally been brought into the light, and with it, the promise of a new beginning.